marionettes of our intentions, inventing shapes for our dimensions. The angles of a lover's prose propose anew in great inventions. Oh, understandably, my love, it breaks my heart in three when your shadow and your body decide that it is time to leave.
It may be only a wish, but baby, I wish you didn't leave me. It may be only a dream, but baby, I'm dreaming of you. It may be only the darkness tracing your shape that I'm needing, or the light that reflects the shadows of you. It may be only a wish, but baby, I wish you didn't leave me. It may be only a dream, but baby, I'm dreaming of you. It may be only the darkness tracing your shape that I'm needing, or the light that reflects the shadows of you. Met him down by the Dairy Queen, fell in love by the soda machine.
Welcome, everyone, to the last Feminist Futures Public Talk in our Public Talk series. I'm Jen Roberts, one of the organizers, and I'm really excited to have all of you here with us tonight. As I mentioned, Feminist Futures, this is our last public talk in our Feminist Futures Public Talk series. Feminist Futures has been a month-long hackathon where we have invited 50 folks from across the country to come and share um, ways that they would like to reimagine a future, a feminist future for us all, where everyone and the planet thrives. And so we've had folks engaging in 4 different tracks this month: prison abolition, environmental justice, reproductive justice, and the care economy. And they have been spending the last month working together, coming up with various interventions and ideas to illustrate what they believe a feminist future could look like for all of us. And within that project, we have been having a public event series each week during this month. Our first week, we focused on care. Our second week on world building. Our third week was focused on pleasure. And this week, we are focused on time and joined by 2 amazing historians and archivists, Arianne Edmonds and Karilyn Crockett. And so I'm really excited to moderate this session tonight. And let you hear a little bit more about their work and be able to ask some questions about how they use the past to really help them think about the future. If you are joining us today on our live stream, please feel free to type questions in the chat. We have someone who's watching that chat who will make sure that we see those questions and can get them answered for you. And if you're one of our hackathon participants joining us in our Zoom, of course, you're welcome to put questions in the chat at any time, and we'll make sure that we share them with you all. So with that being said, I want to quickly introduce our panelists for tonight with short bios on them, but we also have their full bios on our website, ourfeministfutures.com. So I want to start with Arianne Edmonds. Arianne is a 5th generation Angeleno archivist, civic leader, and founder of the J.L. Edmonds Project, an initiative dedicated to preserving the history and culture of the Black American West. Ms. Edmonds has curated and presented her research on African American history, collective memory, and legacy in cultural institutions around the country. Over the last decade, she's designed public programming and built civic media campaigns for government agencies, nonprofits, and numerous Fortune 500 companies. She's currently a Civic Media Fellow at USC Annenberg and a newly appointed commissioner of the Los Angeles Public Library. Arianne Edmonds, so happy to have you. And then we have, Dr. Karilyn Crockett. Dr. Karilyn Crockett's career mission is to continue work at the nexus of education, economic development, and urban revitalization. Her research focuses on large-scale land use changes in 20th century American cities and examines the social and geographic implications of structural poverty. Karilyn was the co-founder of Multicultural Youth Tour and what's now called My Town. During its nearly 15 years of operation, My Town created jobs for more than 300 low and moderate income teenagers, who in turn led public walking tours for more than 14,000 visitors and residents. Karilyn served as the City of Boston's first Chief Equity Officer, the former Director of Economic Policy and Research, and the former Director of Small Business Development for the City of Boston. She is an assistant professor at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. Dr. Karilyn Crockett, welcome. So happy to have you as well.
So good to be here. Thanks, Jen.
All right, so let's get started for tonight. So I want to start with just an opening question for the two of you and get you to introduce yourselves in the way that you feel tells us the most about you by introducing yourselves through your work. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourselves by telling us a part of your work that deals with history and time. And I'll kick it off with Arianne.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. This is like such a delight. I'm super excited. And hello, everyone. You know, you've already kind of read my bio, but I like to think about my work as, in many ways, I'm looking for the seeds from the past, the way that we worked in community, the way that we operated within our families, specifically in the Black West. And I'm looking to figure out what were some of the kind of like those little moments that kept us together. You know, a lot of Black history shows that we left the South and moved to the North or moved to the Midwest, Chicago area. And a lot of my research relates to the path that we took to the West, the path that we took to California. And I want to understand why those folks decided to do something a little different, what made them want to be in a terrain that was so different from what they were used to. And so that's, I would say curiosity is the thing that really drives my work. I would say the second thing is that I want to make sure that 100 years from now that people remember how we built our communities now. And I want to make sure that we're not forgotten. So a lot of my work relates to remembering. So yeah, that's kind of the core reasons why I create.
Awesome. And that making sure that 100 years from now we remember is so important, because we see how easy it is for folks to try to erase history even now. And so, yeah, I'm definitely hearing you on that being part of your creative process. What about you, Karilyn? Can you tell us about yourself by telling us about your work?
Sure. And Jen, thanks again for such a wonderful introduction. It is an honor to be on this panel with Arianne. It's just amazing. And I appreciate all the folks that have just made the space for us to be able to articulate ourselves and our truth. This is not a small thing. I do feel like there's a bit of a cipher that's here, which I just appreciate and receive. So thank you. So, you know, I am sitting basically in my living room in Boston. So shout out to Boston. This is my hometown where I'm born and raised. I am sitting here as I guess like the second generation of my family born in Boston. Come from a Black family of West Virginia coal miners. And so when my family came here, they were very much seeking the North and this idea of freedom in the North. And so came here in the 50s and didn't really find it, you know, found a city very much locked down and still locked down under institutional racism and oppressions and an economic system that really was not open to my family's quest for mobility, quest for freedom, quest for more for so many of their children, of their descendants, of which I am one. My family is 6 generations out of bondage. And so we were enslaved in South Carolina. After emancipation, my family migrated to West Virginia. Again, this kind of movement of kind of looking for more free spaces. And so I think the struggle, the very real struggle that my family has experienced in Boston is not unusual. You know, it's not that special. We have a huge diaspora of folks that we're connected to, a loving family, a wonderful family. But the struggle in terms of finding freedom as a geography, freedom as an intention, as a conceptual dilemma, is very much how I find myself as someone born after the civil rights movement, and just trying to understand, how do we get free? How do we make Boston work for us? And so a lot of my career and my research has been defined by this, for me, trying to understand the power of place, the power of intention, and how do you make time work for you as an expression of intention that doesn't have to be in some far away kind of future location that we can't identify, but how do we manifest a certain sense of future right now? So, you know, very much grounded again in my own family story of just trying to move from a kind of a rural, extractive economy and situation to the post-industrial North. And, you know, that affected me as a kid, raised by my grandmother and raised not far from Mass Ave, which for, as many of you know, is where MIT is. And so the fact that I have had this kind of pathway as a neighborhood kid, not far from Mass Ave, and now on faculty at MIT, up the street from where I grew up is an irony that's not sort of lost on me, but a blessing. And so a lot of my work really deals with, how do you try to get folks to kind of retell and reclaim history, taking it out of this sort of masculinist nation state formation to really understand how that tells a story of memory, of intention, and movement. And so really happy to just be here in the conversation and just trying to learn from everyone here.
Thank you so much. I want to build off of that with the next question, and I'll keep it with you, Karilyn, then we'll come back to you, Arianne. But the through line between both of your work is really that history is not settled, right? It's not neutral. And so could you share a little bit with us about how your work remakes history or remakes memory for folks?
Sure. I think a lot of my work has grown out of my own very personal quest and struggle to understand place and placemaking, and as you have referenced, Jen, earlier, the idea of world making, and to understand that so much of what has been true for families that have come to so many of our cities, a city like Boston or New York or LA, where you're getting people who are coming from all over the country and all over the world, has been about how do you claim yourself in spaces that do not claim you, or spaces that are really built on your not only dispossession, but your invisibility. And so I think because what I understand of sort of a very narrow read of a city like Boston. Boston is a city that's really sort of proud of its history, quote unquote, but a very colonial understanding of what that history is, that really fixates on a British expansion and the fight to overthrow a British colonial power, and a very, very narrow understanding of who was affected by that, who are agents by that. Certainly no real telling of the indigenous history that's here, incredible Wampanoag history, incredible history of folks from all over of the world, an incredible Chinese history that's here. I can go on and on and on, but in the midst of that, trying to understand kind of my own story, my own block. And so I think a lot of that has just affected the way that I think about even the telling of stories where they have for places that have huge populations of people that are not represented in those stories. And so in a city like Boston or Greater Boston right now, that is majority of people of color, 54% non-white, that continues to fixate on a narrative of John Hancock, of Paul Revere, of all the folks that we probably read about in school, but maybe glazed over. How do you remake and understand the actually totality of a story of liberation. And so I think that is sort of lots of stories told in my own, in our own tiny apartment where I grew up, where my grandmother who raised me was our family kind of historian and was kind of telling these stories about West Virginia and South Carolina. And that was a huge counter history and counter storytelling that I was getting at home in the 2nd and 3rd grade, and would come to class and want to ask the teacher questions about A. Philip Randolph. And people and the teachers are like, hold on, Marcus Garvey, what are you talking about? And so I think there's something really powerful to try to reclaim in terms of what our families talk to us about, and then how do you square that or refuse to square that with what you're getting in school. So that kind of friction very much affected kind of the way that I thought about things in high school, and then just took that to college. And a lot of the projects where I try to focus now is really residents and thinking about multi-generations of families trying to talk about their migration and immigration narratives and how that actually is transforming so much of the places where we are.
Thank you for that. I think that's a perfect segue into Arianne sharing a little bit about how her work with JL Edmonds, the JL Edmonds Project, also remakes history and memory. And I love that I'm hearing from both of you all like this through line of your grandparents and the stories that your grandparents told or left for you that have now motivated what you are doing in your career, and just how important it is for us to be leaving these stories or these blueprints of things for our next generation to pick up, right, and take and keep going. So I'd love to hear from you, Arianne. How are you remaking history and remaking memory for folks?
Yeah, I love that question. My entry point is through journalism. It's through media. So our family, my great-great-grandfather, Jefferson Lewis Edmonds, who was born enslaved in Mississippi, he learned to read and write through the Freedom Bureau school. So this, opportunity to become educated just after the civil war. He felt like there was only so much he could do in Mississippi. He was actually advocating and was, just after the passing of the 14th and the 15th Amendment, he was able to vote. So he was encouraging other people, other Black men, to get out to the polls. We have all these records of him trying to see some progress in the South. There were a few Black men that actually made it to the Senate, but then there's a whole 100 years where there was just this emptiness, and so he was right there, right at this at this moment where he was able to cross over. We have his emancipation story. He wrote about it for the LA Times, and there's a lot of pain that he talks about in his experience in the South. But there's also this hope. There's this whole generation of Black people during the Reconstruction era that were given a promise. So, and by looking at his story, it helped me to really think about us really fleeing the South, being essentially like refugees, and then that next generation being this generation that knew about their rights, were helping to formulate what Black citizenship should look like. And so that's really kind of the centerpiece of a lot of my work, because I think we are still as a nation grappling what Black citizenship means, and what we actually deserve. And that was actually not the thing that I knew that I was going to be looking at. So I've been, we've gotten our paper digitized. It was called The Liberator. We got all the links in there, so you guys can take a look. But the thing that caught me in my work is that I have the opportunity to remix the way that we look, the way that we think about the Black press, the way that we think about newsmaking. And so, Jefferson used his paper to teach folks how to vote, how to purchase land, how to build community. He did that all in LA. But he also asked us to think about how do we cultivate peace, How do we cultivate joy? How do we find sanctuary when we didn't have that for so long? And so I've seen, even in my work, like, you know, we have this new project. So I have all these like images and papers and all kinds of things. So we used one of our family photos for a project at the Hammer Museum in LA. The Hammer Museum set up all these like community satellite vision projects with Khalil Joseph. He has a whole project called Black News, and it's just like this beautiful reel of Black TikTok and Black Twitter and just like Black history, like all the love, the joy, the passion. And it's, you know, it's on these two monitors, these dual monitors, and it's behind the monitors is this like archival image. And he has them all over the country, actually. And so they used one of our family pictures. It's like a Christmas dinner. And it, I share that story because I think that while we're remixing and shifting and changing the way the medium, you know, this first just started off as a newspaper, but we still communicate the same way. The things that he was talking about are the things that we're seeing in Black Twitter today, the things that we see in exhibitions like Black News. There is this, there's the dual lens that I found in his work and what I find in a lot of Black journalism today, which is, let me give you some tools, safety tools to navigate this nation and to preserve your sanity. And then the other lens is, look how beautiful we are. Look how precious our families are. And don't forget that somebody loves you, you know? And so that's what's been, those are the things that I'm constantly wanting to remix. I'm like, the medium can change, but the message has been the same forever since we've been here.
I love that you're talking about the pieces that you're remixing. Like the message stays, the remixing is in
the medium.
And I think that connects to our next question, which is really centered around what folks like us who are designing new futures, like what parts of the past should be at the table with us when we're designing? Like what should we really be thinking about? What should we be reaching back to get? What should we be looking for that is going to help us create a truly new future where we do keep the messages that are right, but just the mediums are shifting and adjusting to take us where I think our messages maybe have always wanted us to be. I'll start with you, Dr. Crockett.
Well, thanks, Jen. Please call me Karilyn, unless you want me to grade your paper or something, please do. Okay. I would say that as designers of the future, as you term it, it's really important to understand that, if I could use the term midwife, what it means to be kind of a midwife of power in very intentional ways, because I understand kind of the making of these sort of national stories or local stories is creating this sort of version of power of the state or the nation, or creating citizens or subjects. And my own experience, and certainly some of what Arianne shared too, that you get the sense that there are people whose power has been taken away through not only acts, but the narratizing act, the violence of these kinds of narratives that tell you that you are not powerful. And so the fact that this conception of liberation or freedom in North America, or through the construction of the United States as a nation, that the idea that freedom as articulated through the nation state was absolutely presupposed on the land dispossession of Native Americans, the enslavement of Black bodies, the dispossession of Native American peoples. And so that is a constitutive fact of how freedom was conceived in this country. And so to kind of address that, and to kind of step through what that has meant for so many other groups, what that has meant for a woman's identity, the franchise, all these things, very, very carefully kind of, again, constructed freedoms and unfreedoms. How do you remake that? To me, has to be a core question. I think about my own experience that I'm sure many people here can relate to. I think as a kid, as a Black kid growing up in Boston, after kind of the trauma of the busing crisis that many people know in the city, so much of what I was learning as a young person was what I couldn't do, where I couldn't go, what Black people didn't have, and whom we could not be. And so I grew up here feeling extremely depressed, actually, as a young person, just feeling like there was no sense of possibility, of a future, of power for me and so many of my friends. And so that kind of light switch turned on a dime when there was a community organizer activist who kind of walked us around literally through a few neighborhoods one afternoon and just told us about so much of the struggle, the organizing of people like Jovita Fontanez, of folks like Mel King and other, and Tani Lee, who's on the faculty at MIT, people who had actually really engaged in powerful, multiracial, multi-ethnic struggle to build place, to fight for jobs and housing. And so those stories for me were explosive. And because I'd never realized that there was actually agency in these communities that I had grown up in. And so I very intentionally, again, use this idea of kind of midwifing power as a way to think about futurity and alternative building there, because so much of the this kind of the effect, the bodily effect, the cognitive effect, the emotional effect of these stories is you are a person living in a place and you actually truly internally in yourself feel like you do not have power, which of course we know is a lie, right? But is the most powerful thing you can do to unhinge a population, is to convince the population of its lack of power, ability, breath, future. And so to be able to put those things back is one of the most powerful humanist healing acts that can be achieved. And so that is so much of what this cipher, as I've called it, feels like it's about. So I feel like it's not just a work, but it's a call that so many of us are kind of engaged in. Like, how do you heal back people, or give people back the ability to heal, see, feel, and know themselves? And that is the violence of this work, of wrong history making, of powerful history making, quote unquote, that we're dealing with every day.
What about you, Arianne?
I think, being a designer, there's you have a lot of responsibility. I think that designers and folks who are helping to kind of shape the way that we see our world, I don't know that we give them enough credit. And so I love this question, Jen. I think that one of the biggest things I think is listening, and spending time with, and I'm talking about spending time, not like the survey and asking questions and trying to get all the data points, but spending time with the people that this work is for. I wouldn't be on this panel talking with you lovely ladies and being a part of this really awesome event series if I wasn't at the libraries with 10 people, mostly grandmas, just talking about their experience. I spent time with them so that I could spend time with you, So the things that I try to bring with me from the past is spending time with not only our elders, but also talking to the young people. Something that I found in our family newspaper, there's like this section of the paper where Jefferson talks about why he creates his paper and why folks should subscribe and pay for the yearly instead of just the monthly. He was like, of course you'll get a discount, but he said, I want you to know that I do this work for my kids, for their kids, and for their kids. And I just remember reading it for the first time and knowing that he was thinking about me and knowing that he would never meet me. And so my work around preserving our history, our family history, but also the history of Black Angelenos, and really kind of the Black West, so much of it is I'm preparing for people that may not know my name, may not know my work, but that I've created space for them to know who we were so that they can create what they need to. So I think when you're designing, so much of that, I don't think that we get to think that broad. Jen knows this, but one of the big projects I had right before this was with the 2020 census. I worked in their innovation lab. And we did all these like community activations and worked with like grandmas and aunties and cousins and like designers and artists. We did all these like jam sessions. And the takeaway for me was so beautiful because we got to see people understand not only the importance of the census and what it means to be counted, but I got to see some folks kind of light up when they thought about, maybe your kids, 100 years from now will know where you lived or where you migrated from. And there's a lot of issues with the census, you know what I mean? I know it's pretty political and it's intense, but some of the kind of core things that allow us to tap back into who we were 100 years ago is so valuable. So I guess, the only feedback I would share is that remember that you're kind of reaching towards some folks that won't know you or won't know your work while also reaching back, which of course is just, Sankofa and just, really African, that's how we do. Yeah.
I want to stay with you, Arianne, and ask you then, about archiving and what are some of the ways and methods that we can be archiving our own stories or helping our communities archive their stories?
Yeah, I love this. Okay, so I am not like a traditional archivist. Like my archiving I've worked with like community archives and have been kind of the keeper of my own family's archive. And I work with other families that also want to kind of keep and preserve theirs. I think it can start as something as small as just like keeping family photos and recording elders in your family and the images and the papers that you already have, putting them in like if we're going to go real tactical, just putting it in some like acid-free folders. And then documenting, who those people are, what they meant to you. But I would also ask folks to think about, why this piece of history is important. And I think that when we think about special collections within like larger institutions and museums and repositories across the nation, I would say maybe the world, where that helps to kind of dictate the things that are worth remembering. And so what I would push back on for all of us is to think about what are the things that are important for you to remember? What are the things that you want your community and the people who come after you to remember? We have pictures of our family at the beach in Santa Monica, and just a little bit further down in Manhattan Beach, like in 1911, and they are giving full outfits. Okay, I'm talking vests, double-breasted suit. Like I was like, we're doing all this on the sand, but they had to give us a full look, and I want to honor that. But what's so beautiful is that, they were at one of Manhattan Beach's Black beach resorts, which, and I'm sure a lot of the work that you're doing, Karilyn, about this, a lot of the land was seized through like eminent domain abuse and a lot of harassment from the KKK. And so they lost that land. So, our family has these pictures of like pure enjoyment on this land. And how, now they're going through a process of potentially returning the land back to the Bruce family. And so these images are important. So I don't think that they knew that then. They just knew that they needed to capture this moment of love, of joy and connection, and really figuring out what you think is important. Because that also, like, as we start to kind of like democratize these kind of current archives, they get to be filled with us, like, the real us. I'll share this briefly, and then, I'll hand it over to you, Karilyn. But I'm working on 2 projects with the LA Public Library. I didn't launch this, but the team launched a COVID-19 collection where people and young people, kids, everybody from the city gets to like add the way that they've been experiencing COVID in this last year. And there's like images and letters and, photos. And I've done kind of like a little bit of an effort to try to get documents and images and stories from folks from our first responders. So I've been kind of like pushing for that. But I think that it could start off as something as small as that. We don't know what it's going to look like, later on. But and the second is that I'm doing this like memory lab with LA Metro. And we're just collecting stories of South LA, which South LA is changing drastically. There's been a lot of displacement, a lot of Black families that was maybe one of the only places they could purchase land. They're being pushed out. And so my effort to make sure that that people remember who took care of that land, during this 100 years or so, that we remember that they did that. So we're collecting their stories. We're like going to, once for those who can share things, they're sitting it digitally, but for the second phase, once we start to like reopen safely, we are going to be going to like a few day centers for elderly and having them record and digitize. So I do a lot of those like community mobile digitizing because I'm obsessed. Okay, we need it. They're not gonna be like, oh, let me call the library and make sure, like, they're not gonna do that. So we have to get our team together and go there and get them. So some of it is like getting out there, like I'll shut up, but this last thing that I'll mention about these like hackathons we used to do for the census is that we had to do them in event places where people would come, like we can't say like, oh, this is fancy, this is nice, and you come to me. Like we had to go to the grandmas, we had to go to the tias, like we couldn't just be doing what we wanted to. So part of it is like, you gotta go be with the people. You have, like, you can't do it well if you're not willing to sit in the living room, sit with them. That's it. Look, I'm out of breath because I'm amped. Okay.
I'm just sitting here vibing on everything that you said and shared. Thank you so much. The journey and the richness of what you do and why it matters and what it means to meet people where they are is like the mic drop, I think, here. So it's fantastic. And I appreciate also the memory you're sharing about sort of beaches and people being on beaches. Here, obviously in Boston, we're right on the ocean, a city that has so much water around it, in it, rivers and beaches, and there's so many of those spaces that had been off limits for people of color and for Black people for a long time. And it was interesting to me to think about, I had referred earlier to the trauma of the busing history. And I think for folks that kind of follow this tagline as Boston, the punchline and the truth of Boston being sort of a very racist city whose kind of racism is so visible and nationally discussed, I did not realize that even the beaches in our city had actually much more racial sort of mixing and socializing before the moment of busing. And so busing as a moment that kind of rewrites some of the boundary lines of the city, racial no-go zones has sort of been instructive for me to think about here, but in general, when you think about maybe some of the cities where you are, other cities around the country, around the world, how these fault lines of controversy or confrontation can actually move over time. Because sometimes we begin to think that it's impossible to repair or rebuild. And part of the trauma of thinking about gentrification, right, is that entire neighborhoods or areas are being remade for someone else. And so those fault lines of where you could or could not go are changing. And so I wonder, when I throw it as a challenge, how the way to intentionally sort of change or dissolve some of these no-go zones in cities to actually be more welcoming, to be inclusive, to be actively and rapidly so. And so that that memory you shared, Arianne, about just beaches and thinking about that has just got me sitting here thinking about the malleability of some of these spaces depending on how we want to activate them. And then I think for me, this question around archives and collecting stories and memories has really been important around understanding collective memory and what that is as a particular type of intellectual history of community, the flow of ideas. A lot of that for me has come out of stories around activism, around resistance, around organizing for new kinds of possibilities. I take a lot of lessons and fuel from myself from the 60s moment of not just thinking about the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement and the women's movement, certainly thinking about those things, but thinking about the materiality of these kinds of movements crashing into urban renewal, crashing into highway expansion. How do we tell these stories of organizing, of fight, of protest for a future as people are literally being either moved or trying to rethink how place can be reclaimed? And so I wrote a book on a highway fight in Boston called People Before Highways, and it really tells the story of the city in the 60s of folks really trying to push out and against the expansion of I-95. And so as we know, so many of these roads around the country during the interstate highway systems expansion have just been devastating for folks who were wealth deprived, or often people of color, Black and Latinx communities, just really devastated, and continue to be kind of actually blown out of so many places that are called sort of since felt as home. So the question is for us, how do we think about not just those actions, but what people try to do? And for so much of that organizing, for me in the 60s and 70s, I'm amazed at so much of what people were saying around kitchen tables, in living rooms, outside, were ideas about how to live in cities that we take for granted right now, whether it's, they wouldn't call it a bike lane, but riding your bike, or having a tot lot or a garden, or all of these features that we think are the amazingness of now, of living life in the city. These were futurist ideas 50 years ago. And so to understand that we are living in a moment that was obviously imagined or designed many years ago, and often by activists who were dismissed, or activists who had really cut their teeth in the civil rights movement and the student movement and the anti-Vietnam War movements, who were saying, it is not up to the government at all. It is absolutely up to us, and to understand the devolution of power and decision-making can really help to fuel and embolden our ideas about the future. And so created this project called Hack the Archive, which has been a hack here, right? To get activists and students and people together. And I think we have a link, I can share that, to get people together to figure out how their stories and looking at collections and existing archives can be used to be reknit together to help us do planning that's now, based on very avant-garde ideas from 50 years ago, often, that really were not really hard-hitting and radical, how they understood the need for very, very different notions of a future that did not just center on business growth or the federal government's interventions, had already discredited that. So we think we're hip and coming up with some new critique, right, or some new analysis, when, as our aunties and grandmas and everyone else who've been there. And so, how can we allow some sense of continuity and rethreading by connecting back to that sense of not the past, but the future? So really humbled by the opportunity to just be in conversation with archivists and activists and young people. There's more work for us to do to think about what a post-custodial aggregated set of collections would look like in a city, again, that has lots of archives, but not really focused on some of the blueprints that I know I'm looking for and that we need and that are out there, but just need to be gathered.
Yes, I mean, obviously I was sitting here nodding as well on this ground. And one of the things that really stuck out to me that you said, Karilyn, was this idea that we are living in the imagination of our ancestors right now. Like, they imagined what we are living in right now, which means that we have the power to do the same thing. And, you know, something I often say to communities when we're doing this work together is that, you know, we've always been innovators. We've been doing it since the beginning. Like, people might have co-opted and called it fancy names, but like, we've always been coming up with what made sense for us and trying to make a way out of no way to make it happen, right? And so hearing, you know, you reinforce that in that way, it gave me a jolt of energy, like a reminder of like the purpose of the imagination right now, right? And what it's creating for us now, but also for generations in the future. And so we're going to get ready to open it up for questions. And I'm not sure if there are already questions in the chat. Melissa, is this a question in the chat that you have? Oh, no, that's a quote. I'm sorry. So we'll open it up for questions. If you have questions, you can put it in the chat. While we're getting ready to see what questions exist, I'm just going to ask you all like a closing question about what do you, if there were unlimited resources, what would be next for you? What are you trying to study, or what would you want to if, you know, money wasn't an option and you could just go and, you know, dig into this in the way that was most exciting for you?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because I've been thinking about, you know, I've kind of come up in archiving through the community archiving world, and just by accident, pure accident, because of what I do with my family. But this past summer, with all the folks that have passed away with COVID, all the police brutality, like just there's been so much grief and mourning. And it made me think differently about archives by like all this mass grieving. And so we put together, a few friends put together these these morning meditations, like mourning, like MOUR, like where we would go to the ocean. And we would meditate, and I would ask folks to bring pictures of folks that have maybe passed, or folks that they wanted to honor, maybe someone who had passed away, had been, you know, killed by the police, something that they felt like they needed to honor. And it made me think about archiving within the body. We went to specific beaches that were designated just for Black people, to reactivate that history and to introduce new people who didn't know the history of these cities, and to talk about some of the devastation that happened there, being forced from that land. And we asked folks to just sit with that a little bit. And so I think that might be the next phase of the work that I want to do. I'm currently actually here in Ghana. I'm working on a book and about our family paper, about the Black press. And I'm you know, going to their national archives, and I'm interested in how we archived before we had the kind of written, before there was this fascination with like putting everything into a repository. You know, we've kept our same food traditions, we've kept our languages, we've kept a lot of these things for centuries around the world. And so I'm interested in the ways that we remember outside of this kind of like westernized structure. And so I know you said if there's no limitations, but you know this about me, Jen, I'm gonna go whether there's money or not, we're doing it. So I'm here now, doing just what you told me, and I'm doing what I want. So I'm interested in how we remembered before we could write it down. And I'm learning a ton here in Ghana about like the chiefs and what was shared for each generation. And it's changing my life. It's changing the way that I see archive as it is like embodied, you know, like in us, the body of the art as an archive. So that's what I want to explore more.
So powerful. I feel like I just want to be your TA or your research assistant. Yeah, like how can I get down? Like, what is there a sign up after this? We'll talk offline. I'm just like, okay.
Let's talk offline. I want a second bedroom. Come on.
That's why I said everybody take a trip to Ghana. Let's go.
You don't have to tell me twice. It's easy. We got a cloud of witnesses right here. So
Yes.
A beautiful question though. I think for me, the question is about time and focus, quite literally, because when I started this project hacking the archive. It started with the premise that the 1960s, like in the 1960s and 70s, there's just like what I call this avant-garde generation of 20-something people who were young folks who were just like, hell no, you know, and stood up, whether it was at lunch counters or as freedom riders or burning bras or being on their campuses and just saying, no, not today. And so I started with this idea that there was a need to really capture the knowledge, the frustration, the heat of this group of folks who at now are approaching sort of 70 and 80 years old. And so what I'm finding is, in truth, these people are passing. I started it as it was sort of like a hypothetical, like a theory. These people will start to pass. And then as the project began, some people that we had interviewed or working with began to die. And I was in these conversations with their family members, children, spouses, sometimes about what to do with their work or how to elevate their stories. And then COVID came, and all of what we've been experiencing, the reckoning has really intensified the need for the work. And so I have been trying to understand for myself how to be with that and to rest for a minute, but to kind of like fuel up, because it feels like we're in such a crucial moment of this cross-generational kind of information sharing and the urgency, just because of the life cycle. Like, how do you honor the life cycle of what is actually happening in terms of a generation of people, a cohort who are getting on in age and who are leaving us? But we have a responsibility, a love mandate to capture their stories, to lift them, to raise them now, and also kind of to kind of move us forward. So part of that is kind of the emotional psychosocial deal, which is real. And I'm finding myself like, okay, well, this is real. This is not just a research project. This is truly people's lives and stories and families, and the preciousness of them has just been magnified for me probably the last 16 months more than anything I could have imagined. So that's one thing. The other thing is just to try to get more attention on the epistemological battles of how knowledge itself continues to be organized in the academy, and even in the Library of Congress, which is really problematic for these kinds of projects. And so for me and for folks that look at activist histories, you know, like buttons, shirts, meeting minutes, flyers, these things that are called quote unquote ephemera, are kind of at the lowest level of the totem pole for how things are organized, but they are the most important for these kinds of stories. And so how do you think about what your subjects and what they need on a human front, and then these also political epistemological battles that you must fight to show that the work that is so crucial for our survival as a species, as people, can be re-elevated when in our own knowledge systems is debased. So there's a twofer here. And as I think about this question that you asked, Jen, the question is really about time and understanding that time is limited in some ways, but how we have to understand that time is cyclical. We got to honor it. We've got to get off this linear notion of we can't make it, progress over all these crazy things. How to sit in our experience, and to honor it and to honor all of those that have brought us here. So that for me is the challenge. It's more of a remembrance. And I feel like conversations like this help us to hold each other accountable. And I definitely received that too.
Thank you so much. I don't see any questions in the chat, and we are almost at time. So I'm going to wrap us up. But one thing that I just wanted to pull and hopefully maybe leave with the rest of the group that's here with us tonight. Something you said, Caroline, you said that these folks had left us a love mantra, like of what to take, what to do, what to show, what to build. And I just really want to encourage us to think about the love mantra we're going to leave. Like, what is it that we're going to leave for the next generation? What are we going to show to the younger generation? How are we going to take what love mantras we've gotten from, you know, our elders and bring that into what we're leaving? Because I really do think we're at a little bit of a watershed moment where we are valuing the intergenerational connections that will lead to our liberation. I think we're realizing that we can't do it in just one generation. Like it is a reach back and a reach forward, right? And I love that we're seeing it the way we're reaching back to gardening more, and we're going back to foraging, and we're like doing all of these things that, like you said, we think we made it up, right? But really it was the love mantra that was left for us, the blueprint that was left for us. And so, I just would love us to think about, to leave this space thinking about the love mantra we want to leave, and like how we really are going to use time infinitely to create a better future. So this was like energizing for me. I don't know if it felt that way for everyone else, but I am so grateful and appreciative for you all and the work that you all are doing and the way that you are showing up in this world for us.
Thank
and
you
so
much.
thank you for being here.
One thing, I thank you for you, Jen. And then, the invitation to look inward and outward to our networks and to the people that have made us. No disrespect to my colleagues here at MIT, but the answers are not at MIT. They are within us and all that we're bringing through to help places like MIT get hip, because they don't know. So just to be really emboldened and affirmed in the reality that it's not about any of these places, it's about what we pull into them. So thank you for doing the work. To you, Jen, for holding us. And Sister Arianne, just wonderful to be here with you so much. So.
It looks like we do have one question. So if you all are okay, I'm going to get Ninti. Ninti, if you would like to ask your question, we'd love to hear.
And there's one more in the chat too. I'm happy to stay. Yeah. Come on, Braids. We see you. This is great.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
So my question is around like the morning meditations. One thing is, do you have any other suggestions around healing in the Black community? Especially, I don't know if you have any context into this, but especially around the prison industrial complex. What sort of meditative or therapeutic things can we do as a community? And this kind of answers a question for the project that I'm working on as well. So that's the question.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That project just came from just kind of a meditation I was having that I was doing in the morning. And I just felt like we didn't have a chance to grieve. Like, I think part of the BLM movement, I read this in a New York Times article a while ago about how what separates BLM from the civil rights is that it's centered around death. It's centered around our grief and around mothers and around womanhood. And it made me think about the ways that we weren't able to kind of collectively grieve the way that we have been for centuries. And so I would think about the things that are missing. The first thing that comes to mind when we think about the prison industrial system is connection and communication with the outside world. And so there's these they do a really beautiful project at the Legacy Museum in Alabama, which includes all these letters from these inmates that are talking about their conditions and what happened and what's going on with their cases. And I think there's some healing around that. It's the places where we're not able to express our humanity the way that we normally do. And I think that's typically the entry point for what needs to be expanded and kind of examined more closely. So the first thing that came to my spirit was definitely letters. What are the ways that we're communicating? It's almost like when we see our young men, it's like they become invisible. Maybe there's a few family members that may still go and visit them, but I don't know one Black family in the United States, even if they are giving me, they have all the money and they have all the stuff, they have some family members in jail, hands down, all of us. And so our relationship with them and how we communicate and still get to reflect back to them their humanity, that they still exist, they're still part of us. I think there's something in that. I think it's the letter, something's there. That's what my heart says.
That was a really moving answer. I really appreciate that.
Oh, I'm glad. There was some other question in here in the chat.
Right? I'm going to read it out for you. From being a Twitter librarian and archiving the digital civic engagement of Black citizenship today to Du Bois's data visualization, how do you see intergenerational resistance as part of joy and memory?
What do you think, Karilyn?
I think even just the question acknowledges it, which is powerful by itself. And so the answer is in there, recognizing that the joy is obviously is an act of resistance, but is an act of strength, a way of organizing and mobilizing when life has been not only denied but is not expected for people. And so my family got and continues to get a lot of strength from church, from the Black church. I come from a bunch of preachers who just hold these spaces for us to just be able to express ourselves through religion, through song, through all of that. And it is amazing to me. Times have been, there are so many tough times that folks collectively experience, and everyone has a way of trying to deal with that. And it's a daily thing. And to be able to recognize the space of joy, but self-expression, self-fashioning. Arianne talked about people coming to the beach and giving you a full look, an outfit in the heat of the beach or the sand, but to know that what cannot be denied is your ability to present yourself, to be yourself. That is an absolutely almost unthinkable act of resistance and boldness, particularly for folks for whom legally and in every way your existence is again denied so actively. And so powerful to think about that question, because it shows an understanding of how change and resistance works and is made over time, which is profound. And so we talk about now self-care, or radical self-care. And there are a bunch of moms, grandmoms, and aunties that could talk about that and what it means. And sometimes it can mean a nap, it can mean a facial, but sometimes it can mean talking to someone. Sometimes it could be crying. Sometimes it could be a walk or growing a tomato, all those things. And to risk our own undoing is to kind of put distance between ourselves and those types of things, and to recognize that they have to be a part of how we live. So a powerful question, and more than a question, a statement and an invitation to think about the truth that's there. So thank you to the chatter.
Thank you, Aditi. So I think that really was our last question, I think. So we're going to get ready to close out. And again, I'm just going to say thanks again. It felt like, a sister chat, and I always love it when it feels like that. And as a reminder, just what you said, Karilyn, about that the answers aren't at MIT or any of these institutions, right? Like, they're in the community, and we have to go seek them out and talk to folks and listen, like you said, Arianne, and listen for real, right? Listen for real, not listen to get them to come to our conclusion, but to hear what the conclusions should be. And so I'm really thankful for you all being here today. Thankful for everyone who joined us in our Zoom, but also joined us live. We appreciate you being with us. This is our last talk of this hackathon. This month flew by. If you missed any of the talks that we've had in our previous weeks, they are up on our website at ourfeministfutures.com. And we hope that you'll go check them out. All of them were just as moving as this one, and I'm sure will energize you to really start figuring out how you want to design your own feminist future. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we will see you soon. Good night.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you.
Thank you.
This was wonderful.